It was, at long, long last, time for their wedding. Invitations had been sent out, clothes had been bought, responses received, and the bride and groom were waiting nervously, uncertain of what the days to come would bring, and nervous too of being at the very centre of attention of the whole village. Nervous even of what their own expectations might be at the prospect of having a life together, a life that was to come after their wedding day. The tables were heavy with food. Enough had been brought that unexpected guests were catered for when they turned up at the last minute, and a great store of wine had been laid in. But this was not quite enough for all those who wanted to come to the celebration of this marriage, to come to the wedding feast. When the news started to spread that the wine had run out, there was huge embarrassment. And the bridegroom, the one who'd been left to organise the wedding feast himself, well, he was humiliated. He was just overcome with shame at this sign of his lack of hospitality. Strange, then, that another store of wine was found, curiously stored in 6 stone water jars, gallons and gallons of it. And it was well mixed and rich, and of the highest quality. Frankly, it was much better than the plonk that the bridegroom had been serving at first. So clearly it was just an odd mistake that this wine had been mislaid until this point. When it was served, to the guests' delight and to the relief of those who had thought they'd ruined the feast and their own reputations, the party went on for days. But the servants who had drawn water to fill the jars, and those who were with Jesus at this wedding feast, and we, those of us who hear the words of John's Gospel now, well, we know where the wine came from. It may not feel like it at this moment in time, in 2021, but the Christian faith is fundamentally about being together in celebration of relationship. It's about the sharing of a feast. It's about life without social distancing and participation in a great party, defined not by that kind of separation, but by coming together in close and committed relationships. Relationships that are built up between members of a community, between disciples, between lovers. Relationships that are built up between God and the whole of humanity. Wine can, in certain contexts at least, symbolise the joy that comes from relationships, from pleasurable experiences that are rooted in our nature as material, living, eating and drinking beings, and which by a common experience bind us together. The quantity of wine created in the story we've heard from John's Gospel today, created from water, held in 6 stone water jars, it must have been tremendous. About 900 bottles worth of wine, and of the best quality. And the superabundance of this image can, in this context of a wedding celebration, bring us a sense of the overflowing fullness of God's gift that comes to us through relationships. It brings us a sense of the way that in relationships we can feel rivulets of God's glory overflowing from our life into the lives of others. These relationships fill us to the brim and more, so that they water those who live around us. Within the context of a wedding day, one of the greatest moments of celebration in the life of a community, to become somebody or something that it is cause for extra celebration, is extraordinary joyous. And this is what the story from John's Gospel says the presence of God is like wine overflowing the brim of a water vessel. Like the moment at my wedding, when my oldest friend proposed to his girlfriend, and then they announced their engagement, just after we cut our cake. This meant that my wife and I knew that our joy was deepened by being added to. It was a joy filled to the brim and then overflowing when more joy flushed in. The story of the wedding at Cana of Galilee is not it's not even really just about wine. It is about the giving of a gift from God to those who attended the wedding feast. A gift that underpins marriage, that underpins all relationships and also crowns them, by allowing people to rejoice at the surprising joy of relationships. The story of the wedding of Cana is about the presence of God in the midst of our human relationships, as the one who has formed humanity so that our lives together are really worth celebrating. God gifts to humanity, and he celebrates in us the capacity we have been given by him to offer ourselves to one another. And in doing so, to act in the best interests not of ourselves, but of the person in whom we are in relationship with. This is the basis for all those kinds of relationships which have some or all of the qualities of a truly good marriage: commitment, care, honesty, integrity, mutuality, trust, service, and love. Relationships like this are formed by something which is at their heart and which is Christ-like, because they come from a gift of love to humanity that is a vulnerable and self-giving gift. This kind of relationship might be a marriage, or it might be another form of committed and loving human relationships. Now, the Church's practice, historically, has been slow to realise the value of committed and romantic relationships, including traditional ideas of marriage. Traditionally, the Church has valued solitary life, or vows of celibacy, much more highly than that of marriage. And the Church's understanding of many forms of committed and loving romantic human relationships, it's still so poor and so limited, so lacking in superabundant generosity, so lacking in an ability to celebrate and to rejoice in what is good about generous and self-giving human love. We are so slow to bless the joy of different forms of covenantal love, which humans find in different forms of relationships. Relationships all formed by something that is a little Christ-like at their heart. Relationships all valued by God because of how they reflect God's loving nature. These relationships may also be friendships, or the sort of commitment to a common life in a shared space that forms a healthy community. Perhaps most powerfully, they may also be the relationship we can all share in as members of Christ's body, the Church. By the joy of relationship, humanity is called to express our deep calling to connect, to relate to one another, to give ourselves vulnerably to one another, just as we ought to, and to understand something of God by making and then by celebrating that gift. And in the very best relationships, human hurts and hearts can also be healed. That's why in one of his sermons on marriage, Martin Luther talks of God's presence coming to a married person in the face of their spouse, as they stand facing each other ready to make vows. When they look at their spouse, they can see in their relationship the real, material meaning of God's creative power and of Christ's vulnerable self-giving. And that's why Martin Luther was one of the first preachers to realise and to preach on and teach on the image of God in the one we are in relationship with. At a wedding in Cana of Galilee, human joy overflowed, just as the wine did. In the celebration of relationships, human joy is underpinned by God's gift and crowned as well by the blessing which also comes from God, which is an opportunity to share of ourselves and to share in love. Those of us who know where the wine at that wedding came from, well, we also share in the knowledge that God's desire is for our relationships to grow, for our desire to offer ourselves in vulnerability and in service to one another to grow, for our commitment and care and mutuality and trust to be formed and shaped in relationship, and for our relationship with God himself, that most important bond of love that binds Christians together, to grow and swell and overflow as an intoxicating source of joy to us and to the world around us.